Next, the hidden video, the exclusive interview, the secrets behind the death of Tupac Shakur.
This is a Jmix exclusive.
Hello all, Jmix here, and I wanted to let all my viewers know about a new podcast from Miss Lena, Nozizwe. It's called Tupac's Murder Was His Case. And recently I got a chance to talk to her. So after you listen to this interview, go on over to the link in the description and listen to episode 0 with an exclusive interview with Detective Brent Becker. So without any further ado, here's the interview.
Your podcast is Tupac's Murder Was the Case. Can you tell us what we can expect with that? And like you just said, 25 years later, why now?
Good question, because 25 years ago when I originally did this story, I pushed my bosses to do it. I wanted to do it. I was very interested in the story, and I thought that it had real cultural significance. I thought it was in league with another tragedy, John Lennon being murdered. I really felt that it was a very important story 25 years ago. I didn't realize that my stories, that people would be posting them on YouTube, and my interview with Suge Knight, and my original interview that I did with the original homicide detectives. And why now? Because a few months ago, I had thought about doing a podcast, and 25 years ago, I could have potentially done a book on it. I had great sources. I had sources in Death Row. I had sources within the Compton PD. I had sources in Las Vegas, and I even wrote an article for Vibe. But a reason I didn't want to do the story then, and I also covered Biggie, was it was just too painful, this 25-year-old, 24-year-old dead. I didn't think I had the strength to write a book, because when you write a book, it takes a great deal of time, and you have to really pour your heart out onto the computer to write. And I didn't think I had the strength to do such a sad story. 25 years later, and looking back at the cultural significance, I remember when I interviewed Suge Knight in jail, when he said, this is a day in history, he wasn't kidding. So the reason I did this particular topic now is I was considering doing a podcast. I was looking at some of my stories that I'd done in the past. When I really did research about Tupac Shakur, there was one big thing that was missing, and that was hearing from Las Vegas Metro. A lot of people have talked about them. There's been a lot of diss, but in 25 years, I was the first to get an interview with them, really the most in-depth, and 25 years later, there was nothing else, really. I mean, there have been a couple of interviews I know related to Frank Alexander, and another interview that was done with a YouTuber who had actually posted my interview with Suge Knight. And so there was nothing there, and I was really curious to find out. So I went to Brent Becker and said, will you do this? And he said yes. I interviewed him 25 years ago for a television program, a primetime crime show, America's Most Wanted. That's when we first met. And now, so that was for television. 25 years later, it's Nozizwe reporting Tupac's Murder Was His Case, a podcast.
Now, earlier you said that you had to kind of fight to cover the murder of Tupac Shakur. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, what kind of resistance were you facing?
Well, it was my bosses, and I didn't have to fight too hard, fortunately, and I do go into it in episode 1, actually. It's coming up on the anniversary on September 7th. When I went to them, I don't know that everyone understood his cultural importance, and I remember somebody saying, if you did a story about what happened to Bill Cosby's son, because about that time Bill Cosby's son was murdered, this person said, well, that I could see that story, but Tupac, not so much. Sometimes some will see Thug Life and not go deeper. One of the things that I do say in the prelude of my podcast is that he was definitely living life in stereo. So he was a complex person, and to not acknowledge that is, I don't think, intellectually robust. And the same is true with Detective Brent Becker and just Las Vegas Metro. There's been sort of a mono look at them in terms of, when I was doing my research, really everything was they didn't solve the case, they didn't want to solve the case, politicians told them not to solve the case, and the fact that they hadn't talked about it made me really want to talk about it and find out more, because you can go on YouTube now, as you well know, and get extensive interviews with some of the witnesses that didn't talk much that night. You can see, I was shocked to see interviews with Haitian Jack from the, who Tupac knew in New York. You can just find just about everything. But in this podcast, you really get to hear something you've never heard before. And I will tell you that one of the people who guided me is somebody who really is a fan of Tupac. And I will say that he really made me want to do the autopsy episode. And I will tell you, that autopsy episode, it's going to offend some people, because I know there's an enduring belief that he is still alive. And Brent Becker was at the autopsy. That's what he says. I know not everyone believes that's the case. So some of the things that I learned, and I learned during every episode of this podcast, and again, I did this story 25 years ago. I did months literally of research, watching movies, looking at your YouTube channel, looking at other YouTube channels, and there's something surprising in every episode, including him talking about saying that he knew who killed Tupac within less than a year. So, but the autopsy there's some very surprising information in that. And the next episode for September 7th really goes into detail of what happened that night. Just what happened, who talked. Again, you helped with your resources, with the witness statements, refresh his memory, but to really go through what happened. Because another thing I've noticed in looking at a lot of stories, reading a lot of stories, seeing a lot of stories, is that there are a fair amount of things that are just made up. I mean, it just never happened. And I wanted to do my best to make sure that this is a factual podcast from somebody who was in the room, who did the interviews, who interviewed Suge, who was in the room for the autopsy, who encountered Orlando Anderson in Compton, all of that. I really covered ground that nobody has before, and that's why I wanted to do this podcast, because it was going to cover ground that nobody has before.
With America's Most Wanted, you were one of the first ones to break the story, the infamous MGM tape. I probably shouldn't ask you this, and you can not answer it, but how did you acquire it? And what do you think that the significance of that recording is to the murder case as a whole?
Well, it's very significant in that it shows some of the last moments of Tupac's life. It's also very significant that it showed other activities, and it showed someone who has emerged as really the number one suspect I know you know who that is, Orlando Anderson. It showed him on video. And the thing is, in Las Vegas, with so much surveillance, and actually I talked to retired Detective Brent Becker about this, why there wasn't more surveillance video. But this was significant in that it did capture Tupac and his entourage in some of his last moments, and quite possibly the motive for his killing. And you helped me in that first episode, in that Brent Becker did not take home his police file. So when I was asking him questions, he had to really rely on memory. So I went clicking on the computer and found you have on your YouTube page, your YouTube channel, you have some of the documents, and he verified all of what you had of some of the statements that were taken that night. And he took the statements, and so I was able to question him with the help of your videos.
Is that a no comment on how you sourced it, that MGM tape?
You're good. I was hoping you would forget that. Well, I guess suffice it to say I had some good sources.
Yeah, the whole rumor for a long, long time was David Kenner, but I can absolutely say it was not David Kenner, and it's funny because another thing that I got exclusively was the search warrant affidavit that was written by Tim Brennan from Compton PD for the, when they went out searching, all the gang warfare erupted after the shooting of Tupac. And I read somewhere, somebody said it just popped up and so. And I'm the one who walked down drove and then walked in and got from the county clerk in Compton, the city clerk, I got the affidavit because I timed out. I said, maybe it was sealed, maybe it's unsealed, because they have to reseal it at a certain point. And I actually did a countdown, and I've been flying around doing other stories. I kept that in the back of my mind. So I just went down there and said, can I get a copy of it? They said, sure. And by the time I got to my hotel, I will say somebody from Death Row called me and said, we hear you have a copy of that. Can you give it to us? So talk about all eyes on me. Wow. I mean, that speaks a lot to how powerful that record label was in the mid-'90s.
Lord have mercy. And I was not exactly happy about it, because I thought whoever, if they want to give it to a reporter, another reporter, if they want to give it to somebody who's an attorney, couldn't they go drive down there and get it themselves? It kind of annoyed me, quite frankly. It still chaffed my hide 25 years later.
Well, bringing up Death Row Records, you interviewed Suge Knight. What are your thoughts on Suge Knight the man? Do you feel like he was being particularly honest with you?
Oh, you get right to the... Well, I will tell you this, and, thinking about that interview that I did, and that was 24 years ago, and doing so much research in advance, because I've been researching the podcast since early this year, and there were things that I sensed 25 years ago that I found to be quite true 25 years later. One of the interviews that I saw was with, doing my research, was with a reporter who talked about doing an interview with Suge at the Can-Am studio, and Suge was not happy with what a particular question. And this reporter said that he basically made him re-record over all the questions, and then he said he repeated every question in order with the responses without him even asking the questions, this reporter, until he got to the one he didn't want to do, and he didn't do that one. But that tells you, and you should have known before that, Suge Knight is a very smart man, very smart man. To remember all the questions in order, verbatim, he's a very intelligent man. I use the word shrewd. I know, and I do talk about this in my podcast, he was not crazy about some of my questions, and our interview kind of came to a very quick end. So, and I'll say this, I'll also get into it in the podcast, is that he did tell me before we started the interview that if he needed to find me, he would. And I have a friend who was a photographer for Newsweek, covered wars, and he told me when he found out that I'd done the story, he said, if you told me that you were going to do an interview with him, I would have told you not to do so. So it was an experience, to say the least.
Great answer. Was that a hard interview to land?
You know, what really helped me quite a bit was that I had contacts in place that were related. I had contact sources in Compton that were related to folks at death row. So that helped me get an in. So I think that was an advantage. But one other thing that I'll say about Suge, I saw him before you did your interview, but I saw him on the street a couple of times, and I don't want to say streets like he's running the streets, but one day I was at my bank a few years ago, and there he was. And he was very angry with the people at the bank, and I had a camera with me that day, a DSLR, and I wanted to take a picture, and I thought I was being on the down low, and he noticed and said, no pictures. I was like, whatever. He didn't recognize me, which was fine, but he was very angry, and after he left, I said to the bank tellers, do you know who that guy was? And none of them did, and it was kind of ironic in that they seemed to be pretty chill. And again, in reading a lot about what went on in Death Row Records, boy, I mean, they had only known the backstory. And then I saw him one other time. I didn't speak to him this time, but I saw him at the Four Seasons in Beverly Hills with his red pickup truck. So, and it was also a day that Justin Bieber was also at the hotel. There were a lot of girls, young ladies outside looking to see him, and Justin Bieber, and there I saw Suge Knight. So I have seen him a couple of times after the interview, but that experience, that once was enough, I think.
Do you feel like he's been unfairly targeted in the press regarding the murder of Tupac Shakur because of his reputation that precedes him?
In the sense of people thinking that he did it?
That is correct.
Well, you know, that interview, what's really striking to me is that 25 years later, I did interview Suge Knight. I did have interact with Reggie Wright. I did meet with Orlando Anderson. He was supposed to do an interview. I had a crew ready to go, and he came very polite, soft-spoken, and said no. I met a lot of the key players, and obviously Brent Becker, Mike Franks, who was his partner, and Kevin Manning, the detective sergeant. So I met a lot of the key players, and in that interview 25 years ago, I did ask about Suge Knight to Las Vegas Metro. I did ask Suge directly about his involvement. Las Vegas Metro told me no, that Brent Becker, he said no. So that's what I reported. I asked Suge directly, and I talked to the Las Vegas Metro, and those were the answers. That's been my reporting.
you brought up Orlando Anderson. Did he? I mean, what are your thoughts on him? Did he seem like he was scared of retaliation, and were you surprised to hear that he'd been murdered?
I would have to say yes and yes. He presented in one whole episode, which is titled The Usual Suspect, is about Orlando Anderson. And now doing all the research and hearing how he is characterized as a hitter and very much of a shot caller. The person that I met at his lawyer's office was very soft-spoken, very polite. So that's what he presented. But I will tell you that over the years, especially in working almost a decade at America's Most Wanted, it's never good to stereotype or categorize people because you never know. And for me, you want to hear what people say, you want to do your research, but you want to see for yourself. And I'll say my interaction with him, he was very polite. I will say when I saw interviews that other people got, he did seem to be smiling, very definitely about Tupac's murder with his responses. I also happened to write an article for Vibe magazine after he was murdered, and again, that gives you a different picture of who he was if you just look at the circumstances of that shootout in Compton. So that has been an enduring question and I still don't really have a good answer. And I asked retired detective Brent Becker about why it was that why there wasn't retaliation toward him. And I've seen a lot of videos, and there's really not a satisfactory answer for me that's in terms of what's been stated. So that's a big question.
This is a Jmix exclusive.
What up, shut up?